Well, the girls had pushed off from the bank and they were enjoying themselves so much that they weren't paying attention to which way the current had carried them. And before they knew it, 5 warriors jumped out from the brush, 3 Shawnee and 2 Cherokee. One jumped into the river and grabbed the buffalo tug on the front of the canoe and began to pull it to the bank. The girls screamed, but the Indians grabbed the girls and pulled them into the brush and quickly signaled with knives at their throats the penalty if they continued to scream.
Welcome to Shuck Beans podcast dedicated to ancestry, values, and traditions of Appalachian culture. I grew up in Southern Appalachia and I created Shuck Beans to highlight true stories and authentic books, music, and achievements by guests who love and respect this region as much as we do. On today's podcast, you will hear about one of Appalachia's bravest men, a trailblazer, and you will meet a North Carolinian who spent many years, decades, researching our hero. Randell Jones is author of two award winning books, In the Footsteps of Daniel Boone and Before They Were Heroes at Kings Mountain. Randall earned his engineering degrees from Georgia Tech and his MBA from UNC and Chapel Hill. The Daughters of the American Revolution, the Kentucky Historical Society, and the North Carolina Society of Historians have all honored his works. Welcome, Randall.
Thank you, Phoenicia. Good to see you today.
Today, if you're listening to this podcast, this won't make so much difference to you. But if you're watching us on Facebook or YouTube, all of the photos that you will see today are pictures that were taken by Randall over the last 2 decades. And thank you so much for sharing those with us.
Yeah, that's my pleasure.
Well, I want to jump right in, Randall. To many of us, Daniel Boone is best represented by deerskin pants and those little raccoon hats that we used to buy when we were all kids. But this image, I believe, diminishes his impact. And after years of researching Daniel Boone and writing about his life, which story stands out the most to you?
Well, that's a great question, Phoenicia, and I appreciate that, and I appreciate what you're doing through your podcast uh, to connect people to a better, much deeper understanding of the Appalachian area. So, thank you for that. And I think the one story that people enjoy the most, and that for which Daniel Boone is the most famous, is the story of the kidnapping and rescue of his daughter Jemima and the Calloway sisters. And that's the story that made Daniel Boone internationally famous. And usually, when I get a group of people, and I certainly did this when the first edition of this book came out in 2005, I would very quickly in my presentation begin to tell that story. And if you would like, I'd like to share just the opening lines of that story to help people get in the mood of understanding Daniel Boone's story.
Yes, absolutely. I think that the courage of these young women is also a significant part of this story. So I look forward to hearing it.
It was the summer of 1776, just 10 days after the signing of the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia. Though it would be months before the news of that historic event reached the men and women on the frontier of Virginia in a county called Kentucky. Now, they had arrived there just 15 months earlier under the leadership of Daniel Boone, who had marked the trail from the Long Island of the Holston River in today's Kingsport, Tennessee, through the valleys of southwest Virginia, across the Cumberland Gap, and then north to a spot where they built on the banks of the Kentucky River, a settlement that they call Fort Boonesborough. Now, in those 15 months, they had had clashes with the Shawnee, who desperately wanted these intruders, these invaders, these trespassers to leave their hunting lands. But in the last few weeks and months, the settlers had prevailed in this conflict, so that on this particular Sunday afternoon, July 14, 1776, The settlers had their guard down just a bit, and as they often did on a Sabbath afternoon, they were promenading around the fort wearing their Sunday best clothing and visiting with their friends. In fact, Daniel Boone was lying in his bunk wearing his pantaloons rather than his breechcloth and leggings, which he usually wore on the Kentucky frontier. On this particular afternoon, Jemima Boone, Daniel's 13-year-old daughter, had convinced two of her friends, Betsy Calloway, age 16, and her sister, Frances Calloway, age 14, to go with her in the fort's only canoe floating on the Kentucky River so they could dangle their feet over the sides and cool off on this hot July day. Well, the girls had pushed off from the bank and they were enjoying themselves so much that they weren't paying attention to which way the current had carried them. And before they knew it, they had arrived at the side on the far side of the river where Daniel Boone had told them never to go. And no sooner were they there than 5 warriors jumped out from the brush, 3 Shawnee and 2 Cherokee. One jumped into the river and grabbed the buffalo tug on the front of the canoe and began to pull it to the bank. Francis Calloway stood up in the canoe and began to flail away with the flat of the paddle. The girls screamed, but the Indians grabbed the girls and pulled them into the brush, quickly signaled with knives at their throats the penalty if they continued to scream. But their screams had been heard. Young boys playing on the fort side of the river heard the screams, ran to the fort, sent up the alarm. The men grabbed their rifles and they ran down to the river. Daniel Boone, barefoot and in his pantaloons. And then the story goes on from there.
Ah,
And
thank you, that was fabulous.
that's the story that really gets people's attention and understanding some of the perils that that Daniel Boone and all the people who lived on the Kentucky frontier had to deal with at that time.
Well, Randall, before we wrap that story up, though, having recently read your book, In the Footsteps of Daniel Boone, I was most impressed by how those young ladies were really able to maintain their own composure and stay alive for several days until they were rescued.
Well, that's the continuation of the story. These girls were all experienced frontiersmen, and as the Indians pressed them deeper into the woods, they began to drag their feet along the ground to scratch a trail. They began to
Ah,
frequently fall and break off twigs to leave evidence of their passing. They even tore
ah.
off bits of cloth from the bottom of their dresses. So these girls had helped rescue themselves as the story continues by leaving a path for these men to find. And so the story goes on for 3 days, and, my telling of it goes on for about 10 minutes, but Daniel Boone successfully rescues the girls with a company of men, and, they didn't know which way the Indians had gone, but they took the girls and they went back to the fort, and that is the story that made Daniel Boone famous. And it was because 8 years later, John Filson, who was a land developer,
Mhm.
had interviewed Daniel Boone, and he wrote a book in 1784 called The Discovery, Settlement, and Present State of Kentucky. But to
Ah.
help that book sell, he included a 32-page appendix called The Adventures of Colonel Daniel Boone, and that story was in there. And that boy, did that help that book sell. It was published on Daniel Boone's 50th birthday. It was read all up and down the Atlantic coast. It was translated into French. It was translated into German. Daniel Boone was internationally famous in his own lifetime. And 50 years later, after that rescue, James Fenimore Cooper used that kidnapping and rescue as the basis for his writing the similar scene in his famous novel, The Last of the Mohicans. So you see, when we say that's the story that made Daniel Boone famous, and so that's the story that most people know about him.
How amazing it is that even in 1784, it was his public relations connection that made him famous. There were so many pioneers who were having similar experiences, but Daniel Boone had Mr. Filson, and
Well,
that made all
absolutely.
the difference. That
Absolutely.
made
We
all
we
the
often
difference.
w absolutely, and we all, often say that, there were other pioneers out there doing the same things that Daniel Boone was
Mhm.
doing, not all of them doing all the things, but certainly Daniel Boone had better PR, so that was what
Yes,
made him
yes, and
famous.
even today, right? Isn't that what it's all about? It's a little name recognition. Well, Randall, we have a very limited amount of time. And of course, Daniel Boone lived, I believe it was 86 years. So because I want to keep my audience in mind, to really talk about this unbelievable appendix that you have in the footsteps of Daniel Boone, which is why I bought the book, which is how sort of how we connected. I grew up near Cumberland Gap. We often drove by the spot on 25E in Pineville where Thomas Walker had just walked just over, not far from the edge of the road, and seen the Narrows, the gap in the Pine Mountains. And you probably know locally that's known as the Nars, as not the Narrows. And we also took 421 oftentimes into Virginia and never really paid much attention to the fact that Daniel Boone's son, James, had been murdered there in a massacre by some Indians and not far from the edge of that highway. So, what I would love for you to talk about is how did you come to understand that the knowledge of Daniel Boone is still the spots where he walked? Uh, are still very accessible today, and you've included more than 60 pages in the back of this book to help those of us who live in Appalachia and in those states who want to stop and commemorate what Daniel Boone did.
Well, that's a great observation that we can still go to all the places, many of the places that relate to Daniel Boone's life, and that's the basis for my approach to history is to put the story on the landscape. I cannot take you back in time, but I can take you to the places where history happened, and that's how we time travel. So this book takes you to 100 sites spread across 11 states where you'll
Ah,
see markers, monuments, plaques, historic homes, replica forts, and 8 statues that we have of Daniel Boone in the country. And when you look at the map, that Daniel Boone uh, from 1734 to 1820, that was the span of his life. In those 86 years, the land that he traversed is now covered by 11 states, and that stretches from Pennsylvania in the east to Missouri in the west. And the two big surprises for most people are that he was a prisoner of war in Detroit and that he actually went
ah,
to Florida and bought a town lot in Pensacola. So you look at a map of the
yes.
eastern United States and you realize that Daniel Boone covered all of that land uh, on foot, horseback, or canoe. It was all muscle power because this was before we had even steam power. So it's a remarkable um,
Mhm.
reminder of what the pioneer era involved, people moving, across the landscape place to place.
Well, since you brought up that he was a prisoner of war in Detroit, that's an excellent transition into the story of how Daniel Boone helped save the lives of many men who were captured while they were making salt in what we now know as Kentucky, and imagine heading out of Kentucky and walking to Detroit or horseback or canoes. It just seems impossible when we think about how far that distance is. So why don't you share that story with us?
All right. Well, it was January of 1778, and Boonesboro had been settled just, you know, almost 3 years before. And one of the things they required on the frontier to preserve their meat was salt. And the way they got salt was to go find some briny water at a salt spring and boil it
Mm,
down. Well, you would do this in the winter. So in January of 1778, a party of 27 salt makers went up to the lower Blue Licks in Kentucky and began to boil down water, and they were taking 30-day shifts. So these men would be there for 30 days, and another group would come out and replace them. So these 27 salt makers were eating food that was provided to them by Daniel, who would go out and hunt because most of the men were spending their days chopping wood. So they're making this salt, and Daniel Boone is out hunting. And while he's out hunting, he gets captured by a party of Shawnee, and they knew who he was, and he they told him that uh, they were wanted to capture all of the men, and Daniel did not want these salt makers to be massacred because they were outnumbered substantially. So he said, "I will surrender the salt makers," and so he did surrender all these 27 salt makers, and the Shawnee took them across the Kentucky River,
mhm.
and the Ohio River, and they went into what's now Ohio, and they had to Daniel Boone had to run the gauntlet, because of a promise that he had made and a promise that they did not make. Well, after they were in the Shawnee village for a while, they decided to keep 17 of the 27 salt makers, but they wanted to sell 10 of them to the British uh, as prisoners of war that could be exchanged for British soldiers. So uh, to do that, they would marched all of the Daniel and the 10 men that were going to be traded up to Fort Detroit, which is Detroit, and there Daniel Boone was interrogated by uh, Henry Hairbuyer Hamilton, who was the lieutenant governor of Quebec. And it was then that Daniel began to perpetrate a ruse because he
Mm.
promised Henry Hamilton that he would surrender Fort Boonesborough. And so then, uh, to make a long story shorter, he came back to the Shawnee village where he lived with Chief Blackfish, and he was adopted as a son into Chief Blackfish's family, and he was given the name Sheltawee, which means big turtle. And so Daniel was a prisoner in this village for 4.5 months after he had come back from
Wow.
Fort Detroit. And it was during that time that, because he understood some of the Shawnee language and he discerned that they were preparing to attack Fort Boonesborough. The problem at Fort Boonesborough at the time was they had not finished their stockade. So the people there
Mm.
would have been massacred by the Shawnee war party. So, Daniel knew that he had to escape, and so
Right.
he picked his time, and he made a break for it, and he covered 160 miles in 4 days on foot, including swimming across the Ohio River, and he only had 1 meal, and that was on the morning of the 4th day. So he gets back to
Wow.
Fort Boonesborough on June 20th of 1778 after being gone for 4.5 months, and discovers that his family had given him up for dead because he had been gone so long and they'd heard nothing from the other salt makers. So
Mm.
Rebecca, and the children had gone back to North Carolina, but Daniel knew that he needed to stay there. So they uh, reinforced the stockade and they prepared for this imminent attack, but the attack did not come through the summer. But in September of 1778, the Shawnee showed up with their British advisor standing in the back just out of rifle range, and they laid
Ah.
siege to Fort Boonesborough for 10 days. And there were several unsuccessful attacks on the fort. There were even attempts at treachery, and Daniel Boone defeated those. And then the Shawnee war party, after 10 days, they just retreated and they left. And at that point, Daniel Boone was charged with treason because he had, in his interrogation with Henry Harebuyer Hamilton, people thought that he had cut a deal for himself. And because he had
Ah,
been adopted into to Chief Blackfish's family, people thought he was a little too friendly with Chief Blackfish when Chief Blackfish came and laid siege against the city. So Daniel Boone was tried for treason at Fort Logan, and he uh, defended himself so successfully that he was not only acquitted, but he was promoted to major in the
ah.
Virginia militia. And at that point, he left and he went immediately back to North Carolina to find his family who had not seen him in 10 months and did not yet know that he was still alive.
What
So
a
he gets
reunion, right?
he gets back to North Carolina in the fall of 1778, and he stays in North Carolina for a year, and during that year, he started recruiting other people to come back to Kentucky with him, and in the fall of 1779, he goes back to Kentucky with 100 people that he has recruited, and one of those was Abraham Lincoln, the grandfather of the future president. So that's
So
when you
wow.
bring up the matter of, Daniel Boone and the salt makers, that's the whole story that comes with that simple beginning of capturing him while he was out hunting for buffalo to feed the salt makers. It was just a major event in his life.
And so Abraham Lincoln's grandfather followed Daniel Boone back from North Carolina through the Gap? Did they come back
Well,
through Cumberland Gap?
they came through Cumberland Gap, th the Lincolns were coming down through the Shenandoah Valley.
Ah,
But
okay.
they united and they made their way through the Cumberland Gap together.
I always like to try to make this connect this to our listeners who are interested in genealogy. And as I shared with you, we have in my family a fourth great grandfather, and he has there's a published claim where he said he fought in the Revolutionary War. And he gave great detail about this in 1834. Well, the problem, of course, is that he was born in 1776, the year that the American Revolution began. So, of course, his claim was denied. But when I put that issue out on Facebook and I posted, the denial along with his testimony that has specific details in it, the Virginia militia was one of the proposed sort of answers to that question. Why did Benjamin Howard believe he fought in the Revolutionary War when he actually fought most likely as part of the Virginia militia? So many of the ancestors of people in Appalachia that may have thought they fought in the Revolutionary War were actually fighting for one of the state's militias. And then that's what I hear you saying is that they were there in the Virginia militia, and I don't wanna go down that particular trail, but you also mentioned that the Lincolns came down from Shenandoah Valley, and Boone is bringing his family back from North Carolina, and I happen to know that the Benjamin Howard's family came up from Georgia, but they too came through Virginia and through the Gap. So, can you talk a little bit about those various the wagon trails, the Buffalo Trace, the Boone Trace, and how all of those trails that had been followed by Native Americans and by buffalo and by other animals for many, many years became the routes that brought people through into the West.
Yes, that's a great question. I mentioned earlier that the story that I told about Jemima Boone, that's the story that made Daniel Boone famous. But the thing that Daniel Boone accomplished that was probably most important was his marking of Boone Trace, which was the
Mhm.
beginning of America's first westward movement in 1775. And in his marking of that trail, they arrived at the banks of the Kentucky River in April of 1775, and unbeknownst to them, it was in April, that same month, when the fighting erupted in Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts. So the American Revolution and America's first westward movement were moving at the same time. And Daniel Boone made his entry into the over mountain area and into the wilderness of Kentucky following game trails. These were often buffalo traces, they were deer trails, but he was following the route that game had gone. And these were indeed established Native American trails. The
Mhm.
Shawnee and the predecessors, that you go back thousands of years. These trails were very obvious because people used them uh, as footpaths to move for trade and for war. So Daniel Boone would, in on the Virginia side, he was following well-established tracks, and then beyond Cumberland Gap, he uh, followed again the traces and tracks that had been um, established by animals, but he made blazes in trees so that those who came behind him would be able to follow those blazes along these footpaths and make their way all the way to Fort Boonesborough, which was going to be the outpost. Now there were other settlements, Harrodsburg and Logan Station, that were also on the frontier, and they had been established by other frontiersmen, but those people had come down the Ohio River and come inland. The Daniel Boone marking a trail through the Cumberland Gap is really the effort that opened up this land to the settlement after the American Revolution from 1775 to 1810. You had 250,000 people move
Mm.
through the Cumberland Gap and spread out over Kentucky, and that was America's first westward movement. So they weren't building any roads. They were simply marking paths that already existed. And the route to Fort Boonesborough was a footpath. It was a pack horse trail at best. Uh, the first wagon road was not built until 1796 by the Commonwealth of Virginia,
Wow.
and that was the Wilderness Road. And it
Okay.
was for a wagon, and it went to Crab Orchard, so from Cumberland Gap. So Boone Trace and the Wilderness Road only overlap for the first 20 miles. So the answer to the question, did Daniel Boone mark the Wilderness Trail? No, that was a wagon road built 20 years after he had marked Boone Trace. And so that's an important differentiation. It's something that people need to know. And there's an organization in Kentucky, the Friends of Boone Trace, that has been sharing this knowledge and helping people follow the replication of that historic route uh, s- for the last 20 years. And in fact, last year we had the 250th anniversary of Boone Trace and ended up at Fort
Oh.
Boonesborough with a big ceremony and celebration. So, the Friends of Boone Trace is a great organization for people to connect with, to, to keep alive that unique part of Kentucky history that comes through Appalachia.
Well, I will have to put a link to their website. They have fabulous maps on their site as well because I was visiting before we got on, and I'll have to put a link to that down in the notes. But my real question is, did you walk from North Carolina to Boonesboro?
I walked during sections of, last year's,
Oh,
250 reenactment.
fabulous.
Yes, I
Oh,
joined
that,
in
that
sometimes. And, a big shout out to Doctor John Fox, who's the, organizer and founder
yes.
of Friends of Boone Trace, and so he's done a good job, and that's a resource that, other people can continue.
Well, and it's a resource that we now know about and because of your book in the footsteps. I haven't held it up yet, and I think we're going to put a screenshot of this on, but in the footsteps of Daniel Boone, and of course you have the classic photo or painting of Daniel Boone there on the front of the book. And what we know about him, we mainly know through, as you said, the writings of Mr. Filson. But how do we continue to remember and commemorate Daniel Boone today as we plan to celebrate the 250th anniversary of our own independence of America?
That's a great question, and people have been celebrating the life of Daniel Boone for a long time. The Daughters of the American Revolution uh, created a commemorative trail called Daniel Boone's Trail, and they did this between 1913 and 1915. The DAR in 4 states put up 50 cast iron markers across 400 miles from North Carolina across Northeast Tennessee, Southwest Virginia, across the Cumberland Gap, and up to Fort Boonesboro. And 30 of those 50 cast iron markers are still out there.
Mm,
So there's been, for over a century, we've had people interested in establishing this history and making people aware of it and bringing it along into the modern era. And that feeds into my approach to history of putting the story on the landscape. So helping people understand where Boone Trace actually was and branching off from it into the other parts of the settlement of Kentucky that's the history that we research and that we tell and that we celebrate. So that's one way is the DAR commemorated that. We also have 8 statues of Daniel Boone, and just for comparison, we have 30 some statues of George Washington, but how many people in the United States have 8 statues? So when
right.
people say, "Who was Daniel Boone?" Well, he's the man that has 8 statues, so that's how
Right.
important he is. But there is no national park, there is no national museum, there is no national monument to Daniel Boone, but all across the eastern United States, we have these markers, monuments, plaques, historic homes, replica forts where people in local communities have wanted others to know that Daniel Boone was here. And that's
Mhm.
that's the impetus for this book is to help connect people to all of these different stories that are told across these 11 states.
Well, thank you so, so much for being on Shuck Beans today. I've personally enjoyed In the Footsteps of Daniel Boone and have felt so remiss at not having paid more attention. And now I have this guide so that when I go home and I'm in that area, but you talked about 11 states. This book outlines his life geographically, chronologically. You've got all the photos. It is a resource that can be found on your website or on Amazon. And if you would like to know more about Randall's work on Daniel Boone, his books are available at his website, randelljones.com. That's RandellJones.com. And his site also includes links to the Personal Story Publishing Project and to 6-minute short stories. In fact, that's how I first came to know Randall is, he published my short story about my dad and then allowed me to actually read it on 6-minute short stories. So that's also, connected to his website. And don't forget to subscribe to Shuck Beans podcast wherever you're listening. and to share with others who love Appalachia and who want to keep the respectable stories of our region in front of people. There are so many ways that we can talk about the positive impact that Appalachians have had on our country as we celebrate our 250th anniversary. Also, you can hear this just as audio on wherever you get your podcast, and your comments and likes are also very helpful. Shuck Beans podcast is uploaded the second Thursday of each month. And thank you so much for listening. And I hope that you'll get a copy of In the Footsteps of Daniel Boone. And if you find yourself in one of those 11 states this summer, take the time to stop and commemorate the guy who, carried his axe and paved the way. So thank you so much again, Randall. And it's been a great honor having you here. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Phoenicia, for inviting me to be on your show today and to share this story about Daniel Boone. I know it's important to the Shuck Beans audience, and it's been my pleasure to be on your program today. So thank you so much.
Well, you are very welcome.